The day my parents' will was read was supposed to bring closure. Instead, it shattered everything I thought I knew about my family. 3 weeks had passed since the car accident that took both my mother and father. The grief was still fresh, hanging over me like a storm cloud. I sat quietly in the lawyer's office, staring at the framed certificates on the wall, while trying to ignore the ache in my chest. Across from me sat my younger brother, Ryan. Unlike me, Ryan seemed surprisingly relaxed. He wore an expensive designer suit and kept checking his phone, occasionally smiling at messages from friends. That wasn't unusual. Ryan had always been our parents' favorite. Growing up, he got new cars, expensive vacations, and endless second chances whenever he made mistakes. I got lectures about responsibility. When our father became sick 5 years earlier, I was the one who moved back home to help. I drove him to medical appointments, managed household bills, and spent countless nights caring for him when his condition worsened. Ryan rarely visited. Still, I never expected what happened next. The attorney cleared his throat and opened the will. Your parents left specific instructions regarding the division of their estate. Ryan straightened in his chair. The lawyer looked at him first. Ryan, you have inherited the Miami property. A huge smile spread across my brother's face. The Miami property wasn't just a house. It was a waterfront mansion worth approximately $2 million. It had a private dock, a swimming pool, and breathtaking ocean views. Then came the next part. You will also receive the primary investment portfolio and associated financial accounts. Ryan nearly laughed out loud. I felt my stomach tighten. Surely there was more. Surely my parents hadn't forgotten everything I had done for them. The lawyer turned toward me. Ethan, you have inherited the Alaskan property. I blinked. The cabin. I asked quietly. Yes, and my heart sank. I had seen pictures of that place. It was an old wooden cabin, sitting alone in the Alaskan wilderness. The roof leaked, the walls were deteriorating. There was no modern plumbing and barely any electricity. It was practically worthless. Silence filled the room, then Ryan chuckled. You've got to be kidding. A few relatives exchanged uncomfortable glances. My aunt finally spoke. Well, I suppose your parents knew what they were doing. But her expression suggested otherwise. Everyone in that room looked at me with pity. For the first time in my life, I truly felt abandoned. The meeting ended shortly afterward. Outside the office, Ryan couldn't hide his excitement. Looks like Mom and Dad finally recognized potential when they saw it. I stared at him. You mean after I spent years helping them? Ryan shrugged. Maybe they just thought I deserved more. His words hit harder than he realized. That night, I sat alone in my apartment, surrounded by old family photographs. I searched every memory for signs that my parents had valued me less. The painful truth was that I found plenty. Ryan's mistakes were always forgiven. My sacrifices were always expected. By midnight, anger had replaced grief. If my parents believed I deserved a broken cabin while Ryan received a fortune, then perhaps I never knew them at all. The next morning, I made a decision. I would fly to Alaska, not because I wanted the cabin, not because I expected anything valuable there. I simply needed to see the place with my own eyes before selling it and moving on. At the time, I believed I was traveling to the greatest disappointment of my life. I had no idea that buried beneath the snow-covered wilderness was a secret capable of changing everything. 3 days later, I stepped off a small bush plane into the freezing Alaskan wilderness. The cold air hit me like a wall. Snow stretched across the landscape in every direction, interrupted only by towering pine trees and distant mountains. It was beautiful in a harsh, lonely way. A local driver helped transport me and my luggage to the property. When the cabin finally came into view, my disappointment returned instantly. It looked even worse than the photographs. The roof sagged under years of neglect. Several windows were cracked. The wooden porch leaned dangerously to one side. Parts of the exterior walls were weathered and discolored by decades of brutal winters. "This place needs a miracle," the driver muttered. I couldn't disagree. After he left, I stood alone staring at my inheritance, a broken cabin, while my brother relaxed in a mansion beside the ocean. The unfairness still burned inside me. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. Dust covered nearly every surface. The furniture was old but sturdy. A stone fireplace dominated the main room. Hunting gear and faded photographs decorated the walls. To my surprise, the place felt strangely familiar. Many of the pictures showed my grandfather standing outside the cabin decades earlier. He appeared proud and confident, often posing beside mining equipment or groups of workers. I remembered my father, occasionally mentioning that Grandpa Henry had spent years in Alaska before moving south. But nobody had ever talked much about it. That first night, a snowstorm trapped me inside. With little else to do, I began cleaning. The work distracted me from my thoughts. The next morning, I climbed into the attic to inspect the roof damage. That's where I found the first clue. Hidden beneath loose floorboards was a small metal box. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside were several old notebooks, a compass, and a folded map. The paper had yellowed with age. Across the front of one notebook, written in my father's handwriting, were 4 simple words, "For Ethan if found." I stared at the message for several seconds. Why would my father leave something specifically for me? Heart pounding, I opened the notebook. Most pages contained observations about the surrounding land, weather conditions, and landmarks. Then I reached a passage that made me freeze. If you're reading this, it means you've come to the cabin. Trust what you discover here. Some treasures cannot be handed to a person. They must be earned. I read the sentence 3 times. What treasure? The remaining pages contained strange symbols, coordinates, and references to locations throughout the property. None of it made sense, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that my father wanted me to find something. Over the next week, curiosity replaced my anger. I spent my days repairing portions of the cabin and exploring the surrounding wilderness. The map became my constant companion. Several marked locations led to unusual discoveries: an abandoned storage shed hidden among dense trees, a rusted mining cart nearly buried beneath snow, and a series of stone markers arranged in a pattern that seemed intentional. Each clue raised more questions. One evening, I visited the local town library, hoping to learn more about my grandfather. What I discovered shocked me. Henry Carter wasn't just a miner. According to old newspaper archives, he had once controlled significant mining claims throughout the region during Alaska's gold boom. Then, almost overnight, he disappeared from public records. Nobody seemed to know why. As I drove back to the cabin that night, my father's words echoed in my mind. Some treasures cannot be handed to a person. They must be earned. For the first time since the will reading, I began to wonder whether my parents had left me something far more valuable than anyone realized. And somewhere beneath the endless snow, the next clue was waiting. The deeper I dug into my grandfather's past, the less my inheritance looked like a cruel joke. Weeks turned into months. What had started as a quick trip to sell a worthless cabin became an obsession. Every morning, I studied my father's notebooks. Every afternoon, I followed another clue hidden within the forests, hills, and frozen streams surrounding the property. The more I discovered, the more convinced I became that my father had intentionally led me here. One clue eventually stood out from all the others. A series of coordinates appeared repeatedly throughout the notebooks. Beside them, my father had written a short sentence: "The mountain protects what the river reveals." I spent days trying to understand what it meant. Then one afternoon, while examining an old topographical map, everything clicked. A narrow river curved around the base of a rocky hill just north of the cabin. I had passed the area several times without paying much attention. The next morning, I grabbed my equipment and headed there. After several hours of searching, I noticed something unusual. A large section of rock near the hillside looked different from the surrounding stone. It wasn't natural. It had been placed there. My pulse quickened. Using a pry bar and shovel, I worked for hours. Finally, the stone shifted. Behind it was a rusted metal door hidden within the hillside. I could barely breathe. My grandfather had hidden something. With trembling hands, I forced the door open. A blast of cold air escaped from the darkness beyond. I switched on my flashlight and stepped inside. The tunnel stretched several yards before opening into a large underground chamber. For a moment, I simply stood there in shock. Wooden crates lined the walls. Metal lockboxes sat stacked in corners. Old mining records covered shelves that had somehow survived decades underground. Then my flashlight landed on something that made my heart stop. Gold, not a few coins, not a handful of nuggets. Boxes filled with raw gold samples and valuable ore. I stared in disbelief. Years of forgotten history sat hidden beneath that mountain. My grandfather hadn't lost everything as the records suggested. He had protected it. For the next several weeks, experts, historians, and legal investigators examined the discovery. The results exceeded every expectation. The documents proved my grandfather still legally owned mineral rights to thousands of acres surrounding the cabin. Modern geological surveys confirmed that significant deposits remained in the region. The estimated value reached tens of millions of dollars. I sat speechless during the final meeting. The broken cabin everyone had mocked was sitting on one of the most valuable properties in the state. Then the attorney handed me one final item: a sealed letter from my parents. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside was a message written jointly by Mom and Dad. "Ethan, if you're reading this, then you found the truth." Tears blurred my vision. "We know this inheritance may have felt unfair. We knew people would judge us, but wealth given easily is often wasted. Wealth earned through patience, effort, and character becomes a blessing." I continued reading. "Ryan always chased comfort. You always chose responsibility. The cabin was never a punishment. It was a gift only you would understand." My throat tightened. For months, I had believed my parents loved me less. In reality, they had trusted me more. The final paragraph was impossible to forget. "Our greatest hope isn't that you become wealthy. It's that you discover your own worth. We always knew you could." That night, I sat beside the fireplace in the restored cabin, reading the letter again and again. Meanwhile, news from Miami painted a very different picture. Ryan had spent lavishly: luxury cars, parties, risky investments, massive debts. The fortune he inherited was disappearing faster than anyone imagined. And for the first time in my life, the balance between us was beginning to shift. The greatest surprise, however, was still ahead. Because Ryan was about to learn the true value of the inheritance he had laughed at. A year after discovering the hidden vault, my life looked completely different. The cabin that everyone had mocked had been carefully restored. The surrounding land had become the headquarters of a thriving mining and conservation company that employed dozens of local residents. I wasn't interested in showing off my wealth. I had spent too many years struggling to become the kind of person who measured success by bank accounts. Instead, I focused on building something meaningful. The irony wasn't lost on me. The place that had once felt like a symbol of rejection had become the foundation of my future. Then one rainy afternoon, my phone rang. The caller ID displayed a name I hadn't seen in months, Ryan. For several seconds, I simply stared at the screen. Finally, I answered, "Hello." There was a long silence before he spoke. "Ethan, I need help." The confidence that had always filled his voice was gone. "What happened?" I asked. He laughed bitterly. "Everything." Over the next few minutes, the story unfolded. The mansion was gone. His investments had failed. The luxury cars had been repossessed. Creditors were demanding payment. The friends who had surrounded him during his wealthy days had disappeared. Ryan had burned through nearly everything our parents left him. Now he was alone. A year earlier, hearing those words might have satisfied me. After all, he had mocked me during one of the most painful moments of my life. He had laughed at my inheritance. He had treated me like I was worth less than him. But as I listened, I heard something I had never heard before. Regret, real regret. I was wrong. Ryan admitted quietly, "I know. I don't expect you to forgive me." I stared through the cabin window at the mountains outside. For months, I had imagined what revenge might feel like. I could remind him of every cruel word. I could reject him the way he had rejected me. I could enjoy watching him suffer. Instead, I remembered my parents' letter. Wealth earned through character becomes a blessing. At that moment, I realized something important. The greatest revenge wasn't destroying someone. It was succeeding without becoming cruel. "Come to Alaska." I finally said. Ryan sounded confused. "What? Come here. If you're willing to work, I'll give you a chance." Another long silence followed. "You do that. This isn't a handout," I replied. "You'll earn every dollar." A month later, Ryan arrived. The man stepping off the plane barely resembled the arrogant brother I remembered. The expensive suits were gone. The attitude was gone. For the first time in his life, he was ready to start over. The adjustment wasn't easy. Ryan worked long hours. He learned the business from the ground up. There were mistakes, frustrations, and difficult conversations. But slowly, he changed. The years of entitlement began to disappear. Responsibility took its place. One evening, we stood together outside the cabin, watching the northern lights dance across the sky. Ryan looked at the building and shook his head. "I can't believe I laughed at this place." I smiled. "Neither can I." He glanced toward me. "Mom and Dad knew exactly what they were doing, didn't they?" "Yeah," I said softly. "They did." In the end, the cabin became more than an inheritance. It became a lesson. The mansion gave Ryan comfort but taught him nothing. The cabin gave me challenges, purpose, and eventually success. Years later, whenever people asked about the greatest victory of my life, I never mentioned the gold, the land, or the money. Because the sweetest revenge wasn't becoming richer than everyone who doubted me. It was proving that character, patience, and hard work were worth more than any fortune. And standing beside the restored cabin that winter night, surrounded by family and a future I had built myself, I finally understood the incredible gift my parents had left behind.